If you are Australian, you'll probably want to look away for the next few minutes. A warning there to Mark and co. This isn't going to be very pleasant for the Aussies. However, the greatest cricket match of all time was undoubtedly played at Headingley in Leeds in 1981. For our American friends, the cricket match that's played every 2 years between England and Australia. There's actually a 5-match series, each match potentially lasting 5 days, and it's referred to as the Ashes. Rather ironic, but it stems from the time that the first time that Australia beat England in England. Somebody put a fake report in the Times to say that it was the death of English cricket, and apparently a stump was burnt and placed in a tiny little urn, and so this huge big competition that's competed for, as I say, every 2 years, it alternating between England and Australia, they actually compete for a tiny little urn about that big called the Ashes. As I say, this was the greatest test match ever. Australia were 1-0 up in the series. They'd won the first match, they'd drawn the second match. In the first 2 matches, the captain of England was Ian Botham, and he was removed as captain in the third test, and Mike Brearley was brought back as the captain. And Australia batted first at Leeds. They scored over 400. England then batted and didn't even manage to make 200. Which meant that Australia could force the follow-on, as it's called, which meant that England then had to bat again to see if they could even, with their total of the second innings, get close to what Australia had scored in their first innings. And at about 135 for 7, things were looking really bad. The odds on England winning were 500 to 1. Out steps Ian Botham, and he decides that he's had enough of this messing around, and he takes the Australian bowlers to the cleaners. He scores 149 not out, and the tail, as we call it, the last few players, their tail wagged, and England managed to get a lead of 130 and then bowl Australia out for about 111, and so England won by 18 runs. It was only the second time in history that a team following on had managed to win a test match, and the fact that it was in the biggest match of all, England versus Australia, as I say, this goes down in history as the greatest test match of all times. To put it into sort of a way that maybe the Americans could understand, the way that Ian Botham played was that he went out and every time he faced a ball, it was like he did a Hail Mary. He just really went for it, and sort of irregardless of the risk, he just went out. And basically, he decided to fight fire with fire. He was not going to be intimidated by Australians. He was fed up with them because, as I say, he'd lost the captaincy and had played really badly in the first 2 tests. Interestingly, he didn't actually criticise the selectors for dropping him until many years later, when he referred to them as a bunch of old farts. But anyway, we'll get onto that later. I posed a question to quite a few people, and it was the question, well, let's start from my own perspective. When I watched Making a Murderer, I was aware as we went through the various episodes, when we got to episodes 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, I'm thinking, how is this going to end? You know, this isn't going to end. You know, how are they going to sort of conclude everything and bring everything to a nice conclusion with everything done as it should have been done? You know, how is this going to finish? And, you know, I think that took quite a... Maybe I was just naive, but I think maybe other people surely felt the same, that, you know, where did this all go wrong? What on earth is happening here, you know? So I posed the question, you know, how should Making a Murderer have ended? You know, what I mean by that is, as I say, we have to look back at the fact that when Steve was released in 2003, he was then arrested in 2005, charged with this murder, which, as I say, at the moment, all we have is a disappearance. We have another person died, similar age, in Manitowoc on the, I believe it was the Wednesday, and she was cremated. So, you know, there are things that we need to find out about there. But the point is that Steve was pursuing this 36 million. Now, he might not have got the 36 million in a email I sent to Mike Griesbach. He had conceded that, you know, Steve Griesbach would probably be looking at around about, he said 3 to 5 million. Some people have said between 4 and 7. Some people have said, you know, it might just only have been just over $1 million had the civil suit continued. And it really is odd, isn't it, that the civil suit actually paid up. It was never concluded. We never did get to hear from Vogel and Kosurek, and yet it paid up. And yet it was never concluded. It was, you know, there was never a decision on that civil suit. It was just a case that they offered Steve the 400,000 because of the fact that he was now in a very dangerous predicament. You know, he was like Ian Botham. He was following on. He was well behind. But what if he'd have taken the attitude of Ian Botham and said, "I'm going to fight fire with fire"? The depositions apparently were postponed because obviously with this threat of this conviction for the murder, everybody's attention and eyes were turned away from this civil lawsuit. One wonders about the people that were advising him at the time. I think one of the things I am finding out more and more, and I'm sure other people that would agree with me, is that all of the people involved in the legal system, they all know one another. You know, they're all friendly with one another. They're all on this various commission here, there. They speak with somebody every day. But isn't it human nature to have too much respect for those above you, because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you? And I'm definitely of the opinion that had Steve if he had said, "No, I'm not going to settle this civil suit. I want this to keep going." You know, as I say, he was offered 460,000, but they went for the 1.1 million, and that's when the offer was withdrawn as soon as Teresa Halbach went missing, and he was being charged with it. As I say, it was all to do with distracting attention away from the civil suit, discredit Steve. But I just wonder if Steve had pursued the civil suit, I think maybe the reporters would have got more of a sense of the fact that, hold on a sec, there's something going on here. You know, why was Steve accused of this murder when he's right in the middle of picking up all this money? You know, why would he do that? There's absolutely no motive whatsoever. As I say, the other interesting thing is, where did this 400,000 come from? There's been speculation that in fact it was simply part of the 460,000 check that was ready to go to Steve, and that they simply laundered off some of that, and it was Dennis Vogel's insurance that actually paid up. But as I say, I find this all very, very odd, very, very strange, that he was never given the money for being wrongfully convicted by the state. That was withdrawn, and then all of a sudden he gets a very similar amount from an insurance company, but it's all to do with making sure that Manitowoc are let off the hook. As I say, I asked a few people how should making a murderer have ended. As I say, I know from my point of view, had he had a bit of Ian Botham about him, he would have fought fire with fire. He could have ended up with a civil suit once Vogel and Kosurek were forced to show up. He could have ended up with between 3 and 5 million, and he could have hired 4 or 5 attorneys from outside of Wisconsin that had no conflict of interest whatsoever with any of the other people involved in the legal system there, and I think he would have stood a much better chance. Obviously, the jury tampering might have sort of damaged all of that anyway. But I think that the whole sort of atmosphere about the place, this fact that, you know, Steve is this really nasty person that did all this to Teresa, I think people would have got the fact that, hold on a sec, he's being accused of this crime in order to distract attention away from the civil suit. So yeah, I've had one or two people reply, thank you very much. One close family member, in answer to my question, simply said, I have no idea how it should have ended. But one or two others have put that, you know, it should have ended completely differently, with at least one arrest in Manitowoc. I suspect Vogel and Kosurik should have been, you know, arrested for their behaviour in this. But I don't criticise me because I don't know the ins and outs of the legal system. All I'm saying is this is what should have happened. You know, in a fair system. Isn't it interesting that we hear from, is it Walt Kelly or Steve Glynn at the end of Making a Murderer, that, you know, when are people going to realise that, you know, this idea that if you have the attorneys, if they do it right, if the courts do it right, if the jurors do it right, you end up with the right decision. Well, clearly Making a Murderer proves that that isn't the case always. Anyway, as usual, let me know what you think, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye for now.